hear you perfect. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
I can yes, hold on one second. This meeting okay, cool. It notifies me that I'm being recorded. Cool. Awesome. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, this is so exciting.
Yes, I'm very happy to have you here, and thank you again for
Yeah.
accepting my invitation, really.
Yeah.
I'm
Absolutely. It's nice
very,
to meet you.
yeah, it is. Like, I remember I first saw your TikTok account, I think last
Mhm.
year, and I was so like I was captivated by the fact that you took accountability for so many things that
Mm.
are difficult to discuss. Like, if I have people who are not Black and I want to discuss a certain things,
Mhm.
I felt like it's more of like a sensible subject because in the
Mhm.
end, the person has a hard time accepting that it is something
Yeah.
that's cultural, something that is systemic, and thus they cannot have been like ignored by it, and thus they also express it in a way. And I thought that it was very
Right.
brave for you to do that. So yeah,
Hmm.
I respect you for that. And also, I was very touched by your story and the way that you were like fighting to find your twin sister. So I'm very happy that you
Yeah.
finally did.
Thank you
And
so
yeah,
much. I
I
appreciate
will.
that. I appreciate you saying that. And it's so interesting because like TikTok for me was like, first of all, I never wanted to do TikTok. I was like, ugh, I was like that millennial that's like trying to put off being on social media in that way. And I was like die
Yeah.
hard, like Instagram, YouTube, that's still a thing. And then I think it was during the pandemic that I was like, okay, you know what? I'm like really bored. I need an outlet. This seems like a really good platform where people are building community. So I finally got on TikTok. But I'm sure as you've seen, because you said you've been following me for like a year now,
Mhm.
a lot of my content is like accountability for like racism or like calling out big corporations and stores for not
Yeah.
treating employees or customers correctly.
Days and the conversations that we've been having around Aquafina's use of black scent. Okay, great. You're calling on black creators to hold space and conversation and provide education. Pay them. Pay the black creators. Their time, their education is worth money. Pay them.
And so I feel like I boxed myself into this very specific niche
Mhm.
of doing those kinds of heavy criticisms.
Mhm.
And so it's really interesting trying to like navigate what I'm trying to share on the platform now, because I don't necessarily always want it to be those heavy topics, but
Mhm.
like my community is basically centered around those conversations. So it's really interesting and cool though, because like there would be no other circumstance where I would meet new friends, you
Yeah.
know, in different
Yeah.
parts of the world like this. So yeah, I'm very grateful that you asked me. And this is like, you don't have many videos of your face on your
No, I
account. So
don't
I was
have
like, I don't
any.
really know what she looks like. Yeah.
I don't have any video. I was debating for a long time if I should reveal my face because since I create so many things because I'm also like a visual artist, I make a lot of stuff and I also do a lot of like heavy criticism.
Mm.
And let's say that here in France it's become like more dangerous to do that because of the way that the
Oh.
surveillance state has become. So for a long
Mm-hmm.
time, because I wasn't sure of what I wanted, how intense I wanted it to be, I did not show my face
Right.
willingly. However, now I'm starting like to think of like showing my face more or just
Mm-hmm.
make also content. But since the whole like my channel, I made it because I want people in a way to realize what being a human is, and
Mm.
especially a human in today's world.
Yeah.
Being a human being dissociated in a way because of the constant simulation.
Mm.
Being human
Mm-hmm.
comes with like very sometimes like existential dread that needs to be
Right.
addressed in order to be, not fixed, but in order to be soothed in a way. So
Yeah.
I wanted to tackle those subjects and make sure that my viewers still felt safe and in presence of
Mm-hmm.
another human, not only like an avatar,
Sure. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and also because I don't know, like I don't know how to navigate social media like
Mm.
in like a professional way. I did not
Mm.
want to show my face first, but now I'm starting like to study it more and understand
Yeah.
it a little bit more. So I think I will when I get more comfortable to the point where you can see my face more often. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I hope so. And I think what you're doing is amazing. You know, I've gone back and watched your content a few different times. You actually recently posted something that resonated with me deeply because it had to do with um, being, you know, the whole argument that we really need to be present in the now to be able to live life to the full extent and to get the most out of life. But you make the point that, you know, we are present in the past, present, and future. And so it got me into this like existential, you know, train of thought of like, wow, I mean, I see the truth in that. And I think for me, a lot of my healing has to do with going back to past traumas and what I've experienced. So in a way, like, even though I'm getting back into the past, I'm still living presently because that's what I'm actively presently working on. So it was a really interesting point that you were discussing. So you talk about so many good topics. So yeah, I'm really excited for this.
Thank you. Well, I believe in cultural revolution first and foremost because so many people are uncomfortable with radicality, and also they don't understand what radicality really is, you know. Being radical to me and being radical to so many people is to be about your words. So when you say something, you actually mean it and you do it. You know, it's not that you just say it to have like a cool positioning, because I feel like over the years since Black Matter became more of a trend, because I actually have been following the Black Lives Matter movement since 2012. Like since I was in high school, I was following what was happening in Harlem and in New York in general. And when that became more mainstream, people started like to position themselves in a way that could like separate them from the global oppressor, like from whiteness. But it wasn't meant in like as in like I'm deconstructing whiteness within myself. It was more like I'm not like those white people. And I'm like, you're still perpetrating the same trauma and the same system without even acknowledging it. And having someone that is in denial, having to discuss and confront that type of person is even worse than actually having like a blatantly racist person in front of you, because at least a racist person knows where she stands, you know. They don't often know why, but they still accept that they're but having someone who's trying to educate you, meanwhile they have the same bias and they actually have like the same level to read the different theories, to hear the different testimonies. It gets, let's say, it gets like emotionally draining, especially when you are usually the first impacted. When it comes like to blackness and all those things. In France, it's pretty much the same thing. I wouldn't say that the intensity is the same as in America because we don't have weapons that are so normalized, you know. I am someone, for example, I always carry a knife with me, but that is something that is not normalized at all. I'm always looked at as an alien because if the police ever catches you, they can arrest you for that, you know.
Interesting.
You can get arrested if you have like more than a 10 centimeters long blade on you. So you have to be cautious of all those things. So the degree of violence really comes from the psychological part and the institutional aspect of it. You have different disparities, like let's say different life paths that are traced for people who are coming from minorities and especially Black people, and it starts at school. So all those things. That's why I thought it was so important for me to video on like radicality and really understand how it is a work. It requires effort. It requires a lot of like introspection, and it's actually possible for people who are not Black, you know, because it's actually possible for people who are closer to whiteness to question themselves and to be like to really try to assess themselves in order to change. So that's why I wanted to ask you, for example, what was your relationship with, how did your relationship with whiteness change from the moment that you realized, oh, I can actually present as a racist person, you know, or there's racism that I have internalized?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So, I mean, I guess to start off a little bit about my background, you know that I was born in Vietnam, but I was adopted at the age of 2 by my mother, who is a single white woman. She was a teacher for 37 years. And at the time, she actually already had a son, my adoptive brother, Josh, who she adopted from Brazil. And so, you know, I grew up in a predominantly white community surrounded by majority white people. I'm trying to think now if, you know, I can even like picture or name the amount of people of color in my neighborhoods. It was very few. And for a majority of my adolescence, you know, I say that I am like 90% culturally white and American because I am. And I have often benefited from the privileges of my proximity to whiteness. And although I might have faced racism early on, as early as the 6th grade, where there was a distinction and an othering of who I am, and that became very apparent to me at that young age, there was just still this overall privilege of having the safety of having a white mother and white family members. It was different from my brother, though, who, as an Afro-Latino, definitely was mistaken for being African American all the time. And so he would suffer the results of that. And I don't think it was until, which is kind of shocking for me to even reflect on and think about, I don't think it was until my late teens or my early 20s that I started to really unpack my role to white supremacy and the systems in this country, and really understand that a lot of the internalized issues that I was dealing with were coming from that foundation of my proximity to whiteness and the roles that I was playing to white supremacy. You know, I've always felt othered. I've always felt different. And I've always had this almost instinctual, reflexive desire to need to fit in with white people around me. I remember at a young age, there would be times where I would go up to my white friends and ask them, hey, do you like see me as white or Asian? You know, and it would be a reward. It would be something I celebrated if they said, oh no, I just see you as white, you know? And so it's really interesting to reflect on all of those ways that I was so desperately trying to be a part of the white community. And now it's at a point where, because we talk about, you know, being radical and having this allyship to Black people, right? And making commitment to be anti-racist. And I at times still get defensive when, because here's the thing, I think that we attach racism to a moral code. And so if someone tells us, oh, you're being racist, there's some sort of trigger where we automatically feel as if our moral code is being questioned, and we make it this very Black versus white, like good versus bad thing, right? And so, you know, I've had to learn how to step back and reflect on my own inherent racism that I was raised with and around. And it is not easy, and it's emotionally draining, but it's more emotionally draining to the victims that I'm inflicting harm on by not doing that self-reflection, right? And see, this is my issue too, as I go off on these little tangents. But essentially, you know, since that realization, since I sort of had those epiphanies about myself, my proximity to whiteness, and my role in this model minority myth, it's been an ongoing phase of reflection and further education and being in community with and making space for marginalized voices. Specifically, I feel like a lot of my advocacy, a lot of my content centers around Black oppression. And, you know, I'm still, to this day, there's still things that I am reflecting on and correcting. So it's been a journey.
Yeah, of course, I understand that, and I think that that's very brave again. Like, so many people have a hard time starting this journey because what you said, that it's like your moral code has been attacked, but it's way more layered and complex than that. For instance, people don't realize that racism and capitalism are actually very linked. You know, they work together because one enables the other, and that is something that people have, like, that's why I'm not the type of person who would point at someone and say you're a racist. Because to me, it seems like tone deaf, given the fact that we were all brought up in a racist system, so we all have layers of racism. I often say that Black people, oftentimes, among like the most marginalized communities, are the most overtly racist people because of the level and the degree of aggression that they get because of racism and that they face because of racism. So I applaud you, and I really respect that path that you took for yourself and your well-being, because it doesn't only have to be only like centered to the extreme that it is like the life experience of Black people, but it also has to be with like your own humanity and how do you reflect on things, you know, when you have been exposing yourself to so much trauma and you have inflicted on so many people so many trauma that you don't even realize at one point. Well, it takes a toll on your humanhood and your mental health. So I do appreciate that. And yeah, the other question that I have was apart from like being close to white, like having like a proximity to whiteness, you talked about privileges, and you talked about how do you, as an adoptee, reflect on this privileged situation. For example, you have been discussing with your sister over the time since you found her. You've been discussing your different life experiences. How do you see that this white privilege has kind of like rained on you because of that adoption?
That is a great question. And it also ties into a lot of the advocacy I do surrounding the adopting narrative, which does emphasize like the white savior complex, which essentially just means that, white people will go into foreign countries and essentially have this like self-proclaimed spiritual calling to go and save these children, right, from these impoverished countries. And I feel like that puts a huge pressure on adoptees to then live their lives indebted to these white adoptive parents that bring them over to the US. And this whole trope of like the American dream, and everyone wants to come to America and build a beautiful life here because there's so many opportunities, and there is truth in that. But I do think it's interesting because for myself right now, I'm trying to figure out how we are quantifying success and like what a good life looks like. I think for me, undoubtedly, I would have chosen to be able to grow up with my family and my sister, right? I would never ask to be separated from them for 25 years. And I think about any parent, if you ask them that question, they would not want to have to give up their children, right? But in terms of my adoption specifically and the privileges that come from me being adopted, I was adopted out of a very impoverished province of Vietnam. The reason for my adoption was because, my father tragically passed away, and my mother became financially incapable of raising all of the children that she had at the time. And so she did make the difficult decision to then give me away out of necessity to be able to take care of herself and my other siblings, and then to also give me a chance at a better life, which essentially turned into me being adopted to a middle-class white teacher in America who made a substantial, living, had a home, didn't have food insecurity, when I was growing up. And I think the privileges that are most obvious to me now are just the fact that, I am Asian American, but the type of oppression I face, I feel is very different for like families that, there's people my age that are like second or third generation immigrants, right? Because their parents that came over and established these lives in America for them. For me, it's kind of like I have a white family that was already established here. And there's a security in that because the social dynamics are just vastly different for families that are here versus like immigrant families. I have observed and realized that growing up, there was like a fascination with me because I was this little cute Asian girl and baby that was brought over here. And it's like this feel good, again, white savior story, right? And so it kind of honestly made me always feel like a zoo animal, right? Like people would make comments or come up to my mom and be like, oh my gosh, she's so cute. Where is she from? How did you get her? Questions like that. Things that are so like intrusive that are not something normal that you would ask a stranger, right? Right. But there was sort of this unspoken understanding, I think, between my mom and people that would ask her, where it was just like a celebration of my adoption, which you would think, to me, it's like, oh, they're just curious, right? Like, why does that matter that they're asking those questions? But for me, and I've had to dissect this a lot growing up, it's like those are just experiences that are just wildly intrusive and invasive. And but outside of that, like I can't sugarcoat that I have had a very comfortable childhood, especially socioeconomically, right? Like I never was really left in financial despair or for want, versus like my sister, who was actually also put in an orphanage for I think a year or two, more locally to where my mom lived. And so when my birth mom returned to that orphanage, she was still there. So I say that because my sister never really had a stable upbringing. She watched my mom go in and out of codependent relationships with men, right? And so, I think that I obviously have this gratitude for having more stability than she did. But I think that it also gets dangerous trying to, compare, because we both had our trials that we've gone through. And she's even said to me before, she said that I wouldn't trade places. Like I wouldn't, I don't feel jealousy that you grew up in America. Like I have come to terms with what has happened, and I wouldn't wish that you would be here suffering with me. And I think that's really interesting because it does make me reflect on like the privileges that I've had growing up. Like my sister only continued schooling into 9th grade. After that, she wasn't doing any more schooling, whereas I had the opportunity to graduate high school. I had the opportunity to attend university for a year, so there are those very apparent privileges that I have, and I have to be aware of that. So yeah. Sorry if I'm like going off on little tangents here. It's probably because I'm a little nervous answering these questions.
No. Like I thank you for your vulnerability, for just you opening up and answering the questions. And I know it's an effort to do that, So I'm not blaming you whatsoever, and okay. Don't worry about that.
Okay.
I think that I don't want you to compare, and I don't want to ask for a comparison, but it really it's a question that I had to do with like labels and labels in a way, and the way that you see activism and the way that you see your disconstruction work. How would you identify yourself politically, or if you were to use like a more scholar terminology, which word would you use to describe your journey into self-discovery and self-disconstruction again?
Wow, that is a great question. It's hard too, because I feel like, especially like US liberalism, when I think of that term and that label, I automatically think about what we're talking about, and performative allyship, as opposed to actually putting in the work, right? Because I feel like here it's very much, as you stated about Black Lives Matter, right? like especially when people were posting in solidarity by posting the black squares on their
Yeah,
Instagram
oh my
pages.
God.
Yeah, I know. And I know we use it a lot as an example, but it is a very tangible example of where it's something quick that people can do to say, hey, like, I don't identify with the oppressor. I'm not racist. I'm not that person. And then kind of move on from that. And, you know, when we say the very like juvenile cliche of like actions speak louder than words, I think that a lot of liberals in the US are quick to do a lot of talk and then not follow it up with that action. So I've kind of been deconstructing like what political party I even identify with, but something that I've discovered and that I feel like I've received a lot of education on and from a fellow TikTok creator. Her name is Dallas. I think her handle is still Freedom Farmer on TikTok, but she identifies as an abolitionist.
Okay.
And this is something that intrigues me because I feel like every time I have a conversation discussing deconstructing the systems in this country, it really returns back to the idea of abolishing all of these systems, reforming all of these structures that have oppressed a lot of marginalized groups in this country for so long. So, you know, I don't necessarily identify as a liberal anymore because of what it has become in this country. Now, I'm naive though to like what that would look like in different parts of the country, like Europe and, you know, like where you're at. And I wonder, I guess that makes me think of a question for you, which is like, do you also see yourself as an abolitionist? Like what do you identify with? And also when you look at US politics, you know, do you see that like performative kind of like labeling and then just leaving it and then moving on to the next thing?
So the way that Europe identifies with the America, with the United States of America, is that Europe sees America as a cultural hub. So Europe implanted their culture in America, and America is basically like the broadcast radio that spreads it even further in the world. So the way that you see liberalism in your country is actually the same as in France. Because we have, for example, a very good example. His name is Macron. He's our current president. And I can't stand him personally. He's been slapped like high-key slapped by someone in the street because he is a performative person. You would see compilations and videos where he, during like the campaign, he would say some stuff, and when he's in power he does the opposite. Like he removed so many rights from people, from the poorest part of the population, that really the country has been in shambles. I don't know if you heard about the rebellion happening in Paris because of like the retirement law. Well, they've done that now. The police has access to our telephones and like micros and cameras, and they can just check it out. Like, we live in a surveillance state, so it's the same thing. It's just that let's just say that since we have such a high percentage of white people, like white French people who have been growing here, we don't have history with the fields on the continent, in the country. The biggest slave trade harbors are in certain parts of France, like in Bordeaux, for example, but they're just like wealthy people. There's no retaliation because the people who actually experienced the slavery from those merchants, they live in America. People who are black and come from Africa, and it's like are immigrants, you know, they don't have enough historical context to truly understand the dynamics and why they are where they are, you know, why they occupy the space and socioeconomic space that they occupy in the French society. What I was saying is that I come from like a wealthy family in Cameroon, and it doesn't come like it's not as simple as in we were just wealthy, because there's still like the trauma of colonization and slavery on the land in mainland Africa. So we were wealthy enough to never miss like food, never miss like shelter, but the level of self-hatred and violence that came with it because of colonization, like the remnants of colonization,
Right.
caused us to like have a lot of like issues. And I realized when I was very young that the reason why Africa and Africans are where they are now is because they literally have had their history like stolen and taken away from even their school programs. And so many people in Cameroon don't even know how come we have independence, because the school will not teach you that. People who actually know about these things, they know that because they still have an ancestor that was present at the time that they were born to tell them what happened. For example, my father, since I was a child, always told me about the trauma of that independence war, and how when he was like just like in school, like in primary school, he would see like cadavers, decapitated body, like so many horrible things. So since I know that cultural revolution has to come, and cultural revolution start with the youth and education. So because I always had that objective to have a school, I always tried to document myself, and eventually I never saw myself as a liberal. I never saw myself as someone that wanted to fit into the system. I think that I identify with the term abolitionist, but here in France we use more Pan-Africanism as a term, because there's this notion of like global consciousness and how we have to get on board with the same goal in mind in order to succeed, and not just like do little like bursts of like stuff. We have to be able to mobilize each other and just build like an alternative culture. And yeah, I understand when you say that you're an abolitionist, because it's quite similar to what I think. I think that the system in itself shouldn't be something that should be kept. I think that we have to get rid of it in order to go back to more fundamental ways to experience life. For example, the idea of productivity should be something that we kind of like get out of our vocabularies.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
We can be productive by nature. It's just for what? Why are we productive for? Are we productive for someone else's dream in order to preserve our livelihood? Are we productive because we truly feel like our soul needs this? And I think that one thing that the capitalism and white supremacy kind of like did, and that I felt like I have to repair, and that's why I make the content that I make, and that's why I made the video on like the past, is seeing the spiritual aspect of things. Now we've become like more and more cautious with the idea of like a spiritual war, because people don't believe in it anymore. However, you will be surprised to know that we actually spend more time there than we spend time here. You spend more time as a soul and awareness in the ether than you actually spend time like in tangible earth. So those are different concepts that I want to reintroduce into like global consciousness. And so, but not in like a narcissistic way, like a new age way, which is like crystals and toxic positivity. It has to do with accountability, and it has to do with like actually putting in the work.
Wow. Do you mind if I take a picture so that I can promo? I also don't know, is this like gonna be the first? Have you done other podcast interviews, or is this your first time?
No, it's my first time making an interview, actually.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna take a quick photo. Yes, I love it. Hold on one second. Let me make sure I get it. I love it. Also, you're beautiful, by the way.
Thank you very much. You too.
Will this be a part of, like, you're going to be starting to do a series where you interview other like TikTok creators or just people in your community?
No. Well, it's a series where I make different like discourse, and depending on the subject, I invite people who I think will be relevant for the whole discourse. But I don't want to fixate on like making interviews only, because for some subjects you still can't find like the most ideal person for that. So it's kind of hard. You can't do that for every subject. But yeah, I do wish in the future to make more interviews for a different subject. But this is not like the core of the series. However, for this episode, I thought that it was a very good idea to have you, because it was a true testimony. I don't like I told you, the project that I had it since I was 8. So I grew up with that programming. I can speak from the point of view of someone who actually have to make like the trip back to like themselves when it comes to like that specific thing. When it comes like to fake, for example, one of the episodes of like my series like Got It that I'm preparing is on the ramification of Black people. And ramification of Black people, I want to talk about like how people usually consume like viral memes on the internet, and how then it's representative of the way that people see and experience like the Black experience in general.
Wow.
So
yeah.
I was thinking of people maybe that I could invite, but the thing is, when you're inviting people on that specific matter, even if they're Black, you have to make sure that their self-identity is very clear for who they are. Because living, like I told you, we live in a world where I still believe to this day that the most overt racist people that I know and that I've seen, because of the level of aggression that they face, are Black people. And so because of that, there's a lot of stuff that is internalized, and they have to make like a lot of work. It might be because my mother and my father are very like strong personality. Like my parents have a very strong personality. My mom hates colonizers with a passion. Like she has the privilege and she has the voice to be able to say, I don't agree to that, even if we're in her home country. And I come from Cameroon, and there you have like some white people who are also very like wealthy, and they still like to think of the country as like their colonies, and they still like to treat people that way, and to the point where they make sometimes some life experiences a hassle for people who are around them. So my mom, I would always see my mom like actually confront them and actually like talk about them and talk to them and like be aggressive to them, because she was like, in your country you think that you have the power to do that. Here, this is my country, you're gonna deal, we do it. And so I have those experiences. That doesn't compare to the experience of like an African American person who never has touched like Africa and doesn't know what it's like, doesn't know what it's like to live in a country where most people actually look like you, you know? And that actually leads me like to another part of like of a question that I had for you, and it has to come with representation. You said that the motivation that you had for deconstructing yourself and like questioning like your own like internalized racism came for your own mental health. But was there any person who you could identify with and who was already doing the work, you know, did that?
Wow. Yeah, these are really great, insightful questions. It's honestly kind of hard to think about it because there's like a lot of sadness that emerges, because I, growing up, did not feel like I had any Asian American role models that I really looked up to. You know, like there would be, this is a really small example, but like on Disney Channel, a TV station here, we would watch like Sweet Life of Zach and Cody was one of the shows, and one of the actresses in that, her name is Brenda Song. At the time growing up, probably from, you know, a very young age up until my teen years, she was one of the only Asian actresses that I would ever see on TV. But even then, like they would definitely like typecast her into very specific roles. She was in a movie called Wendy Wu Homecoming Warrior. You know,
I remember those movies.
It's a fun movie. It's a great movie, but it's like, you know, she would be the one Asian actress that they would put in everything. So that was the one Asian face that I saw growing up. And she was a role model because it showed me, oh, she's on TV, maybe like I can go be on TV and be a famous actress one day, things like that. But in terms of like role models for my activism and role models that kind of were inspiration for my self-reflection, I didn't have that growing up. And I think now, you know, during this journey of deconstructing everything, it's something that I, of course, wish I would have had. And I always wonder, if I had had those types of role models, would my reflections and would my work have began at an earlier age in my life? You know, I do a lot of this, and maybe this is probably a toxic part of this, is that I stay stuck in the past of mourning the fact that I didn't have those role models and that guidance and that community. I feel oftentimes very resentful that I didn't have Asian friend groups, that I didn't meet any Vietnamese people until I was in my 20s, and I moved outside of, you know, my hometown for a little bit. But for me, and it's kind of, I feel ashamed even admitting it, that I don't have those role models, or I didn't have those growing up. But I think that speaks to the fact that there is an urgency and a need for representation of our voices, you know, so that future generations will have those role models to guide them to these, you know, these self-realizations and enacting the work that needs to be done to abolish these systems and reform these systems that are oppressive to us. So
Bleach demons?
If you haven't already seen that video, protect your peace, don't go watch it. She has nothing to say. We already know that addressing racism is not racism, and if you're defending and only being cheered on by people who are consistently on the wrong side of history, maybe reevaluate yourself, because at the end of the day, they don't want her any more than they want me. The only thing that I had to add is watching a person of Chinese descent feign confusion and shock over the term bleach demon is too ironic. Not to mention, she decided to go on this crusade over a video in which a black creator was responding to a comment from a white person saying that even they don't trust white people.
I have always said, if you date a man, watch out, because this man is with this woman, and do not go after him or anything like that. This is not a doxing. I'm addressing my Asian sisters. This is a reminder of be careful of who you pair with. Because this comment was left on one of my Black Mutuals pages, who was given information on the transatlantic slave trade.
Could you imagine being so privileged that you believe the world needs to be continually catered so that things are the most pleasant for you? I couldn't even imagine thinking that shit. Like that babies shouldn't get on planes. You know what you could do? You could get up and try to help.
Healing and healing technologies would be so much more vastly advanced were it not for colonial, cis, white, het, patriarchal, dominant culture. Think about that as we all collectively go through our healing processes. We heal so that we can take down systems of oppression, but we also have to take down systems of oppression to heal.
Can you highlight a difference between the moment you started to do the work and before, and how you perceive Black womanhood in general?
yeah, let me think for a second, because that is, again, a really important question, and I want to do the question justice. So it's also interesting for me because growing up outside of my brother, who is Afro-Latino, and maybe less than a handful of Black women in my childhood that went to grade school with me, I was never interacting with Black people and Black women because they were just not in my communities. And for me, it wasn't until I moved out of my hometown. I moved to a place in the United States called Austin, Texas, and where there was like a more diverse population. And so I was beginning to meet women of color, not just Black people, but other people of color, other Asian people, other Latina people, you know. I think it is when I then became exposed to more diverse communities that I was starting to deconstruct all of the monoliths that were created about, for example, Black women in media. I think a good example of media that created those monoliths and those stereotypes are shows like, there's this comedy station or show that was running that was called Mad TV. It's very comparable to SNL. Saturday Night Live, which is another comedy show that airs in the United States. There was BET, which was Black Entertainment Television. That was, I believe, just recently bought by an actor, Tyler Perry, in the United States. And so that's like something that is being celebrated amongst the Black community, because like that's a big win that it's now Black owned, because I believe it wasn't Black owned for such a long time. But these channels of media we're portraying these caricatures of what a Black person is, right? And so we talk about how, Black people are often stereotyped as aggressive, loud, obnoxious. People use the term ghetto, and all of these very degrading terms, right? And often used in a way to laugh at them as like a comedy piece. And so of course, growing up, that was that idea that I had in my head of what most Black people are. Obviously, that is completely not correct. And so when I was able to move out of my small town where I'm just surrounded by white people, and I started to get to know in person other people, Black women, that is when for me it was like, okay, wait a second. Everything that I was taught about Black people growing up is very wrong. I also think there was a realization because of my brother and his vastly different experience from me when it came to facing racism. He was often profiled, like walking home from work, the police would follow him, walking down the street, right? He was called the N-word on several occasions. He was pressured into fulfilling this role as like an athlete, right? Because the stereotype, all Black people are good at sports. I grew up just immersed in those stereotypes and having that tunnel vision of what Black people are. Into adulthood, when I started deconstructing my broken relationship between my brother and my mom and our family, and leading to him estranging himself from the family, it also made me start thinking about, okay, wait a second here. Like, what is my perception on who my brother is and his role in this predominantly white community? It got to the point where like he was villainized and criminalized because of things that he had done. And I think it just was a very abrupt realization that I was enacting harm and racism towards my brother because of these ideologies that I was raised with and that I believed for a really long time. So in deconstructing that and reflecting on that and how I treated my brother because of that, and how our relationship looks now, or lack of relationship looks now because of that, that for me was just like a huge awakening of like, okay, clearly I have inherent racism where I view Black people as less than and other. And I need to separate myself from that and fight against that because of the personal harm that is very tangible to me in my relationship with one of my family members, my brother,
And when was that? Like, can you pinpoint the time or your age at that time when you had that realization?
I think it was probably like around 18 to 20 years old is when I started. It's like, I know there's a term that people use that's called like the fog, right? You come out of this fog of what you grew up believing, and then that fog started to clear away again when I started exposing myself to more diverse groups of people and not spending as much time around just white people.
I think it leads me to another question for you. It's confrontation. So you talk about like how Black people are pictured as like aggressive and all those things. We know why. Usually it has to do with the fact that then it will be easier for white forces to negate their feelings and to negate like the stuff that they're saying about structural oppression. But then when it comes like to deconstruct yourself and do self like introspection, you like, sometimes there's this like expectation that you have with your family. At least that's what I've noticed, is that sometimes with people who are closer to whiteness, when they have to realize that their families are actually just as white and just as condoning of like racism, there's a type of like that when the fog kind of like disappears, there's a huge level of like disappointment and grief that comes after that. And oftentimes, because people will be zealous, which is not a bad thing, but it's a very normal and human thing to do, they become more confrontational. But how did your relationship with confrontation evolve, and how do you see it impacted your relationship with your family and your friends, and for example?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I was conditioned growing up to be very quiet and very passive about any racism that I personally experienced, and then any racism that I witnessed. Obviously, when you're a kid, you're kind of taught to like, you want to fit in, so you go with what the majority of people are doing, right? And so if that means someone is making a racist joke towards someone else and everyone's laughing, well, I don't want to get laughed at, so I'm going to laugh along with it, right? And I often fell victim to that in roles reversed. You know, if someone made fun of me and oftentimes would call me very derogatory names, nicknames, or just make fun of my eyes, something like that, most of my peers would just laugh, because it's like this social thing that you do. It's like the social cue that happens so that you fit in. And that also, I feel like, relates to just like human instinct of surviving a situation, right? But for me, the older I got, I feel like there was more inner turmoil, where the more passive I was about what I was experiencing and what I was witnessing, the angrier that I got. And so it got to a point where I feel like, instead of like directly communicating what I was feeling and the criticisms that I had of other people and how they were treating other people, or how they were being abusive or racist, would come out in like bursts of anger that weren't necessarily constructive, and would just be perceived as, oh, she's just being dramatic, or she's being aggressive. Sometimes there would be more passive actions where like I wouldn't say directly what it was that I was feeling, but instead I would have a tone of voice that would be perceived as like she's being sassy, or again dramatic, and things like that. And it wasn't until probably, again, like I'm 26 now, it hasn't been until my 20s where I have been able to actually very clearly and concisely state what the issues are and what needs to be corrected. I'll give an example. There was a time where I worked in a corporate office for a major health insurance company in the States. And I remember I had a Black coworker at the time who came running into the break room and was complaining and venting about one of our white coworkers who had made some sort of racist reference to a movie character in depicting this Black coworker. And I remember that she was very upset and distraught about it. And before that time, I would probably just sit back and be quiet about it and just like let it happen, keep my head down so that I could get through work, right? But at this point in my life, when I was finding my voice, I, in that instance, then stepped up or stepped in, and I was like, okay, what can we do to keep you safe? What would you like us to do? Do you feel comfortable going to human resources and telling them about this encounter? Do you want someone else to do it for you? Do you want me to go and talk to them? And in this instance, this coworker gave me that permission to go talk to human resources on her behalf. But I tell this because when I did that, instead of being supported and this being treated with the urgency that it should have been treated with, to keep this Black coworker safe, instead, my leadership told me that they didn't want to hear it coming from me. And they also didn't want to make things bigger than they actually are, right? And so what I brought to their attention was dismissed. And ultimately, there was no resolution to that. There wasn't even like a slap on the hand of like, hey guys, we need to watch how we're communicating with our coworkers so that we don't inflict harm and that we're not being racist towards other people. And I use that example because, you know, that is an example in my adult life where I tried using my voice and I wanted to stick up for someone with their consent who didn't feel safe enough to do it themselves. And in that instance where I assumed because we are adults and we should have developed these skills to be able to address situations like that, I was instead met with towards my actions and essentially was told to be silenced. And so now, I mean, especially with the content and the discourse on my TikTok, there's constant pushback like that. And there's constantly people telling me and other marginalized groups of people to be quiet and not use our voices. But I think that I have developed in a way where even if my voice is shaking, even if I'm scared to do it, I still at least make people know that they are making other people uncomfortable. And I think if we're trying to chip away at the bigger issues here, I think even that can be beneficial, to just let people know, make it apparent to them there is some sort of tension or discomfort. Because in past, when I was just quiet, I just let these people go on about their day thinking that their actions are normal and that they're okay and that they can get away with them.
Okay, that's actually a very beautiful testimony that you gave. I think it's very important indeed to let people know that what they did. I personally, I don't tell people that it made people uncomfortable. I just let them know that this is like great behavior and this is narcissistic. So my way to do, because whiteness is narcissism. If you see it, if you look at it, like it's constructed the same way that narcissism is constructed.
Yeah,
I have a ton of like content on that. That's why I hyper focus on like narcissism as a disease, because not even a disease, because it's not really one, it's just a personality. But like that's why I look at narcissism and compare it to like institutional racism, because it behaves the same way. Passive aggression, not wanting to be confrontational but causing a lot of harm. I just tell the person that you're being a narcissist and it's okay, you just have to accept it. Like
I need to try that sometime.
I taught this class in university about 2 years ago on like institutionalized racism and its impact on like school programs, and especially in the arts domain. And I had one first exercise that I had for my student was to have them list different racist stereotypes that they think when it comes to like primal art. They call primal art in France art that comes from like countries from the global south. So like all the artifacts that they stole and put in their museums, they call it primal art. So I was like, please list anything that you like think of like primal art. And I had this white student who was a white man, he was an adult, and he started panicking. He was like, oh my god, why are you doing that? And I'm like, I know you're racist, I know I'm racist, I know she's racist, just list it. That's all I'm asking you to do, is how racist you can be, so that I know what I'm working with, you know. And out of like everyone, he was still trying to like abstain from talking. But when you look at what he wrote, when you heard what he wrote, it was just it was the most like simplistic way of seeing like people's culture, the most like racist way to resonate with like culture that is different than yours. And he actually, it made him so uncomfortable that he left. Like after the second day, he left the class and he left the course. So usually what I do is just have them feel uncomfortable for what they do. I'm like, you realize that what you're doing is oppressive. You realize that what you're doing is antisocial. If you accept it, I'm okay with it. If you don't accept it, I'm gonna keep like nudging, tripping on you and be like, hey, how are you doing racist? Like all those things. But the end goal is just to let them know that it's a work that everybody has to deal with. You know, this work of like deconstructing the world and the way that you perceive it. Everybody has to do it, even Black people. Now, if you only attach guilt and shame to it, you're gonna be triggered, and I'm going to trigger you. But if you cannot do that because you're in peace with who you are at the moment, I'll respect you. And even if we're not compatible, I'll let you be. you know. So usually that's how I go when it comes to those things. And I've always had issues for that. I always had like issues with institutions for that, but that doesn't stop me, because I know that it is an active work and effort that goes against the system, like goes against the way people's way of life and culture. So yeah, I actually am done with like all the subjects that I wanted to tackle.
Cool.
One maybe last question that I have for you is, what habits have you built for yourself, and doesn't have to be in your daily life, but like that you do quite regularly, that helps you actually do that work?
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much that you can do on a day-to-day basis, in the small things, like the media that you're consuming. Like, I talk about how my TikTok community right now, most of my followers and the people that I'm following are marginalized groups of people, and they're predominantly Black people. So I'm exposing myself to the algorithm of being educated by and from a lot of Black people and other marginalized groups of people, which I think is super helpful, because there's so much that I can learn from that. And there's things that are brought to my attention that before I might have just not been attuned to, because I wasn't looking out for it, or I just, ignorance is bliss. I just didn't know these things were going on. I think other things, it's just like, of course, reading literature from Black people and Black experiences. And something that is really important to me that I try to urge other people to do, like my example of the workplace and sticking up for other people, getting into the habit of being aware of what's going on around you and how other people are being treated around you, so that you can advocate for them. You can pick up on if they're being put in a situation where they're mentally or physically unsafe, or they're being abused. I think that people do not understand how far it can go to stick up for people when we witness things happening. Now, I know it's not necessarily like I'm not just walking out into the street and I'm immediately witnessing some sort of heinous racist act, right? But the microaggressions that we see and hear, and that I'm sure you've experienced, and that I experience on a daily or a weekly basis, there are so many instances where it would have been really nice to have someone there for support. Maybe not even to step in and verbally say something, but maybe just like tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, is there a way I can support you? And I don't think that we're taught to do that growing up. But I think being able to instill that action and inspire that habit into other people, of just being aware, so that we can help other people around us, is something that I try to do on a day-to-day basis. Other than that, I think holding the conversations. Like, I do not have these types of conversations as much as I would like to, mostly because I get nervous about being on camera and meeting new people. But like, holding conversations like this is how we learn about other people's experiences, and learn about perspectives different from our own. And I know, as an Asian American who grew up in a white culture, that I will never have the same experiences as you, or experience the same type of oppression that you've experienced. So the only way for me to really be able to equip myself with the education and knowledge to help protect other people from that oppression and that racism is to listen to you and hear your stories. So listening, that's another good habit, is just being willing to listen and deconstruct everything that you've been taught to do. So
that's a very good way. Like, the way you responded was very beautiful.
Thank you.
And yeah, like I'm very happy that we have had the opportunity to have this discussion. And I truly respect what you're doing. I, again, like, follow you. I'll keep on following you and promoting your content. And yeah, if you have like if you even want to have other discussions, I'll be even like more willing to just sit down and discuss with you and like build a relationship, because I think that really it's something that is important, and I do understand like how this could be lacking to have those type of interactions in your life, since people are not programmed to really interact with Black people or just interact with people outside of their groups. So there's that. But yeah, I truly thank you. I don't know if you had another question, if you have a question for me, or if I'm not taking too much of your time.
I ultimately would just like to thank you for allowing me the space to do this, because I think it helps me, especially with my personal growth. Like selfishly, like I just need to work on my communication and being in community with other people in general. I think for the past 7 months, as I'm sure you've seen me document some of, like I've been very isolated. And that's been very discouraging, because I am someone who thrives in community and interacting with other people. But I think I've become so afraid of people and the community that I have locally that I just have wanted to hide away. So like this has been like so healing to be able to hold this conversation with you. And I'm sure I do have tons of questions for you, but now I'm like thinking maybe I should interview you at some point and come back with like the more in-depth. I mean, I'm just fascinated too, because like I know a little bit about you. I've seen your art and like what you do on social media, but like I feel like there's so much to your story that you could probably share, and I'm definitely curious. So I feel like we should at some point, if you're willing, like hold another conversation at some point, whether that's by way of like me doing an interview or a podcast, or just messaging. But I would love to stay connected with you.